Okay.
Welcome to Christ. Today I'm joined by the brilliant David Kopel. David is an American author, an attorney, a gun rights advocate, and a contributing editor to several major publications. He's the research director of the Independent Institute in Denver in the USA, associate policy analyst at the Cato Institute, adjunct professor of advanced constitutional law at Denver University, Sturm College of Law, and the contributor to the Volokh Conspiracy legal blog. You can check out his website, davekopel.org, and his YouTube musings at Law and Liberty News for Independent Institute Television. So just to begin then, Dave, can you tell us a little bit about your background and some of the key events in your life that have helped to form you and your love for Christ and his church then?
Well, I'd say in terms of Christianity, it was definitely a long process, decades long, of discernment. So there were lots of key events nudging me along the way. But I would definitely say that in this, my guide has been the Virgin Mary. Sometimes when I've been aware of that, and sometimes when she was working behind the scenes and I didn't know about it, at least at the time.
Fantastic. And then regarding more specifically your work, then what first prompted your interest in things like self-defense, gun rights, and some similar concerns?
I suppose partly the general sense of just preparedness. You know, my parents were both lawyers. They were not gun people, but they tried to be conscientious about having enough food on hand, all those kinds of things, wearing safety belts in the car. And as I looked at started to look at the gun issue, and then read articles about people, for example, they called 911 in an emergency and got put on hold. It made me start thinking about that issue. And then when I was at the University of Michigan Law School, the school's leading academic journal, the Michigan Law Review, and one of the ways law is different from other academic disciplines is that the journals are student edited. So I was one of the editors checking the citations and the footnotes on this article by a guy named Don Cates about the original meaning of the Second Amendment, published in 1983. And it was a very groundbreaking article. And previously, a lot of law journals had been afraid to even discuss the topic. And Cates really did a good job of showing what the original meaning is and how that includes the right to have a handgun for lawful protection. And so after law school, I reached out in a variety of directions for policy areas I was interested in, and that was including reaching out to Don Cates. And so he started inviting me to speak at academic seminars. He was organizing at different academic associations, the Popular Culture Association, the American Society of Criminology. And so things kind of built from that.
Fantastic. And have there been any other persons who've been especially inspirational or influential for you that you'd like to tell us about, David?
Well, I guess when I thinking over the course of my life, I've just been blessed to have so many great teachers over the years. And you can start with, in my very early days, Mrs. Romer and Mrs. Martinez, and all the way through law school with professors Francis Allen, Thomas Green, and so many great teachers all along the way. And they've been really helped me develop myself intellectually.
Thank God. Just next, I'd love to look at some of your work that you've published today. So let us begin, if we may, with The Morality of Self-Defense and Military Action, the Judeo-Christian Tradition. Can you tell us a little bit about this really comprehensive study of the Judeo-Christian tradition and why it's important to understand self-defense as a central moral question?
Well, I think everybody, at least in a democratic society, has to make decisions about self-defense. You think about, what will I do to protect myself or my family? And hopefully you never have to actually put that into action, but at least it's something people should consider, just the way you consider fire safety and you have fire extinguishers around, for example, or all other kinds of safety issues. And then in a democratic society where the nation as a whole makes decisions about things like war and peace, we all, at least as voters, have to make some kinds of judgments about those issues at the national level or the community level. And religion, of course, isn't the only way to answer those, but it's over time, history, it's been one of the major lenses through which people have addressed those questions. And in fact, the way it's developed in the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West, it's overlapped very much with philosophy. So besides, sort of pure scriptural arguments, there's lots of other arguments that would be perfectly well made in, a philosophy seminar or any place else. So I think it's an important decision for people to make one way or the other. And this is part of the information that can help people make their own decision.
And then since this is such a polarizing issue, if I might phrase it this way, has your studies then shown self-defense, national warfare, and revolts against tyranny, maybe in different cases, to be holy duties or something like that, or even gross violations of God's will? And how would you divide some of those?
Well, I guess the book would say both, because it looks at that the whole sweep of the Judeo-Christian tradition from, starting with the book of Genesis and coming up to the present. And it suggests that in the Jewish tradition, there's not really a strong intellectual foundation for pacifism, although certainly people can choose to be pacifists if they want. And in the Christian tradition, the book suggests that the non-pacifist argument is stronger, but it also recognizes that there are some strengths to the pacifist argument, and also in between the two poles in the question, there are also conscientious Christians who have taken intermediate positions. For example, they might say, well, I wouldn't defend myself, but I have a duty to defend my family, or if I'm a school teacher, to defend my students. So they wouldn't defend themselves, maybe if they were alone and attacked, but they would defend others in their care. So there's a broad spectrum, and I think at least a lot of plausible points that people can arrive at through their own moral reflection.
Fantastic. That does come across in the book. And I've spoken with some pacifists, even on this channel, Sandy Hauerwas, people like that, even famously.
Yeah.
But I myself, I'm not a pacifist under my reading of the scriptures and your book and C.S. Lewis and different people. Yeah. Why then might pacifists be wrong in this absolute sense to insist that all violent actions are forbidden by Judeo-Christian morality? As you say, there's some nuance there.
Well, I think where they're most wrong is insisting that everybody has to go along with them, which is really kind of a form of aggression. I refer to some, not all pacifists, but some of them are what I call pacifist aggressives, where they have their reading of the scripture, and I don't agree with it, but I'll concede it's a plausible argument, and they're so certain of that, they want to demand that everybody else has to live their way and don't concede the possibility that other people who have read those same scriptures and gone through the same moral reflections may come to very different answers. And some of them go even further then, and they want to use violence, the coercive power of government, of police officers who carry weapons and put you in a cage if you don't do what you're supposed to. They want to use that violent power to force people into their view of nonviolence, which seems very upside down.
Mm-hmm. And I should say within that book, you do cover the whole sweep of Judeo-Christian history, well, as much as you can within a book, combining history, scriptural analysis, and philosophy, as you say, to describe the changes and the continuities of Jewish Christian doctrines about things like the use of lethal force. And your book begins then with the ancient Hebrews and Genesis and covers Jewish history through to the Holocaust and beyond. So can you tell us then a little bit about why and how the Jews have defended themselves over the ages then?
Well, you can start pretty early in the book of Genesis, where there's this guy, Abram. His nephew, Lot, gets kidnapped, held hostage by some invading kings from Mesopotamia. So Abram gets his trained servants and builds a coalition of the other tiny little kingdoms in the area, and they march out and rescue Lot and the other captives. And right after, and when that's done, Abram doesn't ask for some excessive share of the spoils of war. He basically he and the other leaders of the rescue are thinking about what to do with what they've captured from the Mesopotamians. He just says, give my soldiers their fair share. I don't need anything for myself, basically beyond expenses. And his point is he was just doing it to rescue Lot and the others, not because he was out for booty and plunder. Well, right after that, a priest named Melchizedek comes to him, gives him a great blessing, and then in the very beginning of the next chapter of Genesis, God comes to Abram, changes his name to Abraham, says you're going to be the father of these great nations. And of course, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, he's the father of the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. So you can start with that at the beginning, and then you can go all the way through Jewish history to the books in the Apocrypha, like the book of Maccabees, which is in the Catholic Bible, not most of the Protestant one, at least not some of the Protestant ones. And there you have the story of a war of national liberation, when the Jews, starting in about the 2nd century BC, are under the reign of this king from Syria who wants to wipe out Judaism and force them all into his politically correct version of Greek culture. So led by starting with a particular family that leads them, they start a revolt. It takes decades, but the Jews do win their national independence and enjoy a number of miraculous victories against larger invading armies whose objective is to capture all the Jews and sell them into slavery. So the Jewish nation survives because they can fight, and with God's help, they win.
And then moving onwards in history, you cover the philosophers, as we say. So what did some of the leading Jewish philosophers, such as Rashi and Maimonides, have to say in this complex issue then?
Well, they're two of the very biggest, as you point out, both from early in the 2nd millennium AD. Rashi is considered maybe the greatest commentator on the Jewish Bible. And so he consolidates a lot of things that are already in the intellectual tradition, but the fact that he says them makes them all the more authoritative in Jewish thought. So, for example, in the book of Exodus, when Moses is transmitting the new law to the people, one of the laws, it's in chapter 22 of Exodus, is it's lawful to slay a burglar at night, but not to do so if the sun be risen upon him. The interpretation of Rashi and those who come before him is that this should be read metaphorically. It's not really a time of day issue. It's more a question of whether the home invader is a violent threat. So if, let's say your father is a alcoholic, and you find him climbing in the window so he can steal some stuff and sell it to buy more booze, but you're certain he's not going to attack and harm anyone in the home. Then under the Rashi metaphorical interpretation, you can't kill him just to you can try to use some force, but you couldn't use deadly force against that kind of situation. On the other hand, if it's high noon and some folks break in under circumstances where there is a real violent threat against the people in the home, then you can use deadly force in self-defense. Maimonides, besides writing about scripture, was also really the only Jewish scholar in a long period in the diaspora who thought about and wrote about issues of just war. Because the Jews had no political power, they didn't have any kingdom, they really weren't having to make practical decisions about when is it appropriate to invade another country or not, and if so, how would you fight a war? So Maimonides took that on and became sort of the definitive thinker on that topic. And two of his conclusions were that first of all, defensive wars are obligatory. You know, if the land of Israel is invaded, you got to fight. That's not in God commands that. No decision. You know, no need for debate on whether or not to do it. And at the same time, he also took some of the rules for lawful, just conduct of war from the Bible and extrapolated and elaborated on them. And for example, he says, you can't cut down the enemy's fruit trees. In the Bible, it says, don't do that during a siege. Maimonides expands to say, don't do that ever. And that's one of the, even if you could use the wood to build battering rams or things like that, you can't cut down fruit trees. And that's part of a theory of how to wage war in a proper way when you have to, which can sort of in a metaphorical way, at least, is try to minimize the environmental devastation that can come from war. Besides, not executing prisoners and things like that, there are also duties in warfare, even to the non-human environment.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, David. And in a brilliant article that you wrote on Hitler's control, you actually show how gun control helped the Nazis cause such a devastation later in history. Can you share a few lessons that can and really probably should be drawn from this kind of history?
Well, sure. Even though Hitler was a eccentric character in his own way, in terms of mass murder, he was very much a by the book, following the classic historical examples. And what we see in the 20th century and before and even after these days is that when a government is intent on mass murder of a intended victim population, the government works very hard to disarm them first. And it's only after the disarmament takes place, has been mostly completed, that the mass murder begins. And that's just for an obvious common sense reason. It wasn't that the Jews, who were just about 2% of the population, had some ability just by themselves to rise up and overthrow Hitler. But when you're trying to roust people out of their homes and put them on a train to an extermination camp, all those kinds of things, the secret police oppressing people. If the secret police are worried that, if I go into this apartment and try to round up all the people, I might get shot. And maybe I'll take along a bunch of guys with guns along and we'll have a gun battle and we'll win. But the fact that people are going to be shooting back at us makes my job much more dangerous. And so, Alexander Solzhenitsyn talked about that same kind of thing. If only under Stalin, even the people who just grabbed improvised weapons, fire pokers, things like that, some kind of resistance to the secret police would have greatly slowed down their actions.
Mm-hmm. So many of us know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a famous name, but what are some of the examples of armed resistance to the Holocaust that we should remember?
Well, one thing that's definitely not known enough is how two extermination camps, Auschwitz and Sobibor, got shut down by prisoner revolts, where they, in Auschwitz, they managed to make a copy of the key to the camp armory. In Sobibor, they ambushed some of the armory guards and got their keys. And so once the Jews got weapons, then everything broke loose. Some of them fought their way out and escaped. A lot of them got killed fighting, but they had major battles, burned down some of the places. And the end result of that was both extermination camps were put out of business for good. The Nazis were so embarrassed about this revolt of the extermination camps, they wanted to cover it up. So they just leveled those places with trying to leave no trace at all. So you think about, once the Jews got guns, that machinery of mass death, it really threw a lot of sand in the gears and slowed the pace when you had, two of the top extermination camps put out of business. And then outside the camps, you have things like of course, the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt being one of the most famous, where the Jews fought successfully for months and months before the Nazis finally regained control of the city. And even more successful were other than Warsaw, were attempts not to fight in the city, but people tried to escape into the woods and then the swamps and try and fight there. And groups like the Bielski brothers eventually rescued over 1,000 Jews. Groups like the Avengers from Lithuania, who were some of the first to realize that the Nazis were not just medieval style bad oppressors, but something the Jews were kind of used to, but were much worse and intended to wipe out the Jewish people. And there's also lots of folks who are, obscure. A Ukrainian butcher, a guy named Shep Burkowski, started a resistance movement. He and his friends had 5 guns, and they eventually used those to capture 7 more guns from Nazi collaborator policemen who they fought and killed. And so with those 12 guns, they were able to save 120 people who were able to hide out in the woods and wait till the Nazi armies were forced to retreat.
Fantastic. And going beyond Judaism and the Old Testament, then your analysis, as I said, looks at the story of Christianity from its origins through the Middle Ages, the Reformation, up to the present day. What are some of the examples then which demonstrate the legitimacy of self-defense in Christian scripture and in the commentaries that have come from that?
Well, in the scripture, which of course is the New Testament's much shorter than the Old Testament, and covers a much more compressed time period. Unlike the Old Testament, the New Testament doesn't have particular stories about examples of personal self-defense or of others in the direct sense, like Abram's rescue of Lot. But I think and of course there are various passages from which people extrapolate one way or the other. But I think for me, one of the clearest things is the Roman soldiers who become Christians. John the Baptist, Jesus, Peter, and Paul. That's a pretty high quality list of New Testament heroes. Every one of them converts Roman soldiers to Christianity. And in fact, Peter's meeting with a Roman military leader this is after the resurrection and all that, is the inflection point where Peter understands that the gospel, the good news, is not only for the Jews, it's for folks like Roman soldiers, who are not kosher, don't have the dietary laws, all those things. But Peter's meeting with a soldier whom he converts makes him realize that, hey, this message is even broader than we had originally thought. Of course, that's one of the events that ultimately dramatically changes world history. And so as John the Baptist, Jesus, Peter, and Paul all convert these Roman soldiers, there's never any suggestion that they're supposed to leave the army now. It's not like when Jesus rescues the woman from being stoned and he says, go forth and sin no more. Like apparently she'd done something bad beforehand. None of that with them. It's just continue no indication they should stop in their existing profession of arms.
And what are some of the ways the interpretations then have changed over time? And can you give us an example or two of that then?
Well, I'd say a really big one is Romans 13. And that's it's from one of Paul's letter to the Romans. And by the interpretation that was standard for most of the centuries after it was first written, excuse me, for the interpretation of most of the centuries after it was first written, he said, be submissive to government. Rulers are put there for your own good. They wield the sword justly because they have power from God. And so the sort of the main line of Christian thought at the time was, well, okay, the Roman emperor is not a Christian, but Paul says we should go along with that and be obedient subjects, pay our taxes. Of course, we got to follow our Christian rules, even if they conflict with Roman laws, like, we can't worship idols. But to the extent we can just get along with the existing system, that's fine. Later, in the second millennium, and more as that goes on, the leading interpretation instead becomes to look at those words more carefully and say, okay, well, rulers are sent by God for the good of the people. Well, you can compare a ruler to those words. So, maybe the King of France qualifies under that, but say Joseph Stalin definitely doesn't.
Mhm.
He's not ruling over the Russians for their own good. He's ruling actually to harm them intentionally in many ways. He doesn't execute justice. Rather, he uses his metaphorical sword and power of force to promote injustice. So from that, that's one of the sources of the idea that it's not only legitimate, but maybe even just, and a duty to resist illegitimate government.
Thank you for that, David. And you cover some of the luminaries of the Christian tradition again, like Origen, Augustine, Aquinas. Can you tell us about some of those philosophers and how they interpreted some of these passages and this theme?
Sure. So Origen is in the 200s, I believe, AD, and the way he sees, I might be wrong on that. I haven't double checked. It might be a little bit earlier, but his point is, he says, "Yea, Roman army, we're all for you. We pray for your success, but we as Christians don't participate in it because we're set aside in this special kind of otherworldly mission." The same way people might say, today, a priest or a doctor wouldn't engage in military combat. The doctor might be on the field helping wounded soldiers, and the priest might say this is a just war, but the priest's special vocation would not involve serving in the army. And Origen views Christians in that same kind of light, which was a reasonable way to look at things in the time when Christians were a pretty small minority, and they could in that way kind of withdraw from active participation in world affairs. It became less tenable when Christianity kind of swept the table, and everybody you knew was a Christian. You couldn't really say, well, we're going to retreat from these worldly duties because we're special. Now we're not so special. Everybody's like us. Augustine, certainly the main focus of his writings was not self-defense issues, but he did write on just war and things like that, and came out very much in favor of the legitimacy of defending your country in a just war. Also wrote that illegitimate governments are basically no different from large-scale organized crime. The fact that some band of pirate ships comes along and robs people, well, they're sort of the government in that local space. They've got the power and they tell people what to do. And his view was that tyrannical government was no different from that. It was just a large-scale version of organized crime. On personal defense, he kind of took a variety of positions over the years, but the one that he based on his last letter was essentially like we talked about before, is that intermediate position of the Christian wouldn't defend himself personally, but would have a duty to defend people in his care, like his family or others to whom he had a special duty.
And,
Aquinas, go ahead.
Sorry, no, that's grand. I was going to ask you about Aquinas.
Yeah, Aquinas, of course, is the great synthesizer of over 1,000 years of Christian history and the Jewish history before that, and all the thought that's come before it. And he argues that, first of all, self-defense is, including of oneself, is legitimate because you look at the intentions of it. When somebody's coming at you screaming with a knife and you shoot them, your objective wasn't that they will die. Your objective was just to protect yourself. And the fact that the person might die of the gunshot wound was a sort of a secondary result and not the primary purpose. It's called the theory of the double effect. The effect the defender's after is, I want to stay alive because God gave me my life and I have a duty to protect it. And then the injury to the attacker is the second effect. But as long as you're not, trying to kill someone and just use self-defense as a pretext, having the right motive is legitimate. And he also talks about resistance to governments. And some people say, oh, it's seditious to speak against or to try to overthrow a tyrannical government. And Aquinas says, no, sort of like the interpretation of Romans 13 we talked about. Aquinas says, no, just the opposite. The tyrant is the one who's guilty of sedition, of the highest level of public treason and sedition, because instead of the government for the good of the people, which is what God wants, the tyrant is doing the opposite and then creating a disordered society. So resistance to that kind of tyrant isn't sedition at all. It's just putting things back in their proper order where the rulers rule for the common good.
And then taking it to your own country, David, how did some of the New England ministers then actually incite the American Revolution?
Well, the Americans, like lots of people, maybe the Irish were fairly immune from this, but the Americans had this view as, oh, the king is so great and we're supposed to be obedient to that. And because they were mostly subjects who had emigrated from Great Britain to the United States. And as John Adams said, it was really the ministers who changed the American view and said, yeah, of course you're supposed to be obedient to government when it's a good government, but when it becomes a tyrannical government that, for example, violates the traditional rights of the people, like the rights of Englishmen, as they were called, it's breaking its contract with the people, and they only rule by the consent and contract of the people. That's the New England theory, and goes back all the way back to how the Hebrews elected or chose to have a king at the very beginning. It was by their consent. And the ministers argued that, this isn't just a matter of good government and the benefits that flow from that versus the harms of bad government immediately. It's also that if you live under tyranny, it is morally degrading to the individual, because instead of being the responsible person who takes care of his family and participates in his community and self-governance, all those things, you acquire these habits of supine submission and flattery. Who can I flatter and go along with and try and work my way up this chain of tyrannical control? And then these tyrants frequently behave licentiously, and that behavior sets a bad example that infiltrates into all of society. So the New England preacher view was, you kind of got a duty. In fact, you definitely have a duty to protect lawful self-government against tyranny, because it's not only just the quality of the government on the first instance, it's the whole moral destruction that happens to people when they live under tyranny and submit to it.
Thanks for that, David. And something that I find fascinating too is the whole history, well, the whole history of the United States, but things more recently like the Vietnam War. So one of the things you cover is the Vietnam War, and I wanted to ask you about the effects of that war on the American Catholic Church's views on things like national self-defense then.
In the United States, after World War I, where there was a lot of disillusionment about U.S. participation in the war, pacifism started to get a broader hearing in the sort of mainstream Christian community in the U.S. than it had before. And then World War II came along, and pacifism looked pretty well discredited. And yeah, of course, you can make the pacifist arguments. And so what if Hitler and Hirohito take over the world? That's not go complain to God about that one. We're just not going to use force. That argument didn't seem very appealing to most people. And the same problem continued after the war, when you had the Stalin regime and communism trying to impose global tyranny, just like Hitler and the fascists had been trying to do. But then, as the Vietnam War in the 1960s drags on, more and more people start getting disillusioned with that. And some of them, besides, of course, you can always make prudential arguments about this is a good idea to be in this war or it's not. Like maybe it was just that we got in, but the fact is we're not making enough progress and it's not worth staying in, so we should get out. But besides making those kind of direct common sense arguments, a lot of the American Catholic hierarchy and also the hierarchy of what are called the mainline Protestant churches, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and Episcopalians, and so on, they also take a pretty hard turn to the left. And to some of them entirely delegitimize national or personal self-defense. Most go that far, but it gets a much harder edge against the use of defensive force thereafter.
What I find most interesting is how this scales, and as you say, at that self-defense level, that's at least where I would disagree with pacifists. But you point out the kind of philosophical intricacies and theological intricacies of it. So I hope that this question does justice. But I wanted to ask you, what's a fair response then we might give to this idea that we're somehow safer dying without taking a life, even in self-defense, rather than killing, that some pacifists will argue?
Well, and you're meaning sort of safer in a salvific sense, like the ultimate objective is to end up in heaven and not in the other place.
Yeah.
And so the most cautious thing to do that is never kill anybody under any circumstances. That's sort of the argument.
Yeah.
Well, you can see why it's appealing, because it's a bright line rule, and you can sort of make it into a thou shalt not. I'm just not okay. I'm not going to commit adultery. I'm not going to kill anybody ever. And maybe that will work. I don't want to, set the odds on how God deals with people's salvation. But the argument on the other side, goes back to the principle in Leviticus. You shall not stand idle on the blood of your neighbor. And the ways that Christianity, in some ways, allows retreat from the world. Go live in a monastery, or in the 4th century AD, go sit on top of some giant stone pole for 50 days. That's okay within the Christian tradition. But the Christian tradition, and I think the scriptures and the commentary, also urge people towards active engagement in the world. Don't be a good Samaritan. Reach out to even people like the Samaritans who are strangers to you. And so I think as people assess those kind of risks, they got to say, well, maybe if I'm not helping to protect other people, then I'm really being derelict in my duties. Just like people have, I think Christians have some duty, to share the gospel. It all depends on people's particular situations. You don't have to stand on a corner and read out Bible verses very loud. But one way or another, I think there's an urging that everybody share the good news, even if you're not a professional evangelist. And so likewise, all people, at least arguably in the Christian tradition, have some obligations to help their community, and that can include by protecting it, and to define the community broadly by helping to protect even people they've never met.
And using more modern parlance, if we might, then how does this self-defense ultimately tie to the respect for human dignity that is the grand picture of the scriptures, as you suggest, and human rights even, on which both Judaism and Christianity seem to be based?
Right, and this, you can go back to the very early passages of Genesis, where we're told that the man is made in the image of God, and as Genesis sees it, that's why murder is wrong, in a way that like killing a cat might be a bad idea, but it's not wrong in that same sense, because people are made in the image of God, and animals, not necessarily, or not animals, not in this view. And therefore Genesis requires the death penalty for murder. And you don't have to be for capital punishment these days to still see the principle of man made in the image of God. And so therefore human life is sacred, and therefore there is a duty to protect innocent human life. If there's one guy who's about to kill 20 people, and the only way you can save those 20 is to use deadly force against that incipient murderer, then the inherent dignity of every human being comes into play, and by this interpretation would say you have an affirmative duty to save those 20 people.
And thank you for that, David. And something I wanted to ask you, with sort of tying a few things together that we've spoken about, is to ask you, you mentioned a few of the readings of things like Romans there, David. So some people then will read Romans, even Jacques Ellul, people like that, in a more anarchist way. And I know some anarchists would be for a self-defense at the individual level, but they wouldn't be for state national defense, as I say the state is having a monopoly in violence. Then I wanted to ask you about maybe some of the commonalities and the distinctions between, say, that personal and, say, more national self-defense then.
Well, I think the one view is those things are really just on a scale continuum, that, like Augustine said, the three guys robbing you in the alley are just a small scale version of the kleptocratic tyranny that robs an entire nation. And it's been common in intellectual history, especially in the classical period of international law, where starting around the early Renaissance and thereafter, where our modern notions of the international law of war were formed, were based on scaling things up from personal self-defense. So if somebody breaks into your house, you can use force to resist him. But let's say you defeat the guy and you've got him tied up now, the burglar who broke into your house. Well, once you've got him subdued and he's no longer a threat, you can't kill him, just for revenge or whatever. And so from that point, which was pretty obvious in Western intellectual thought, people say, well, that you extend that to prisoners of war. Sure, you can fight them when the war is going on, but once you've taken them prisoner, then you can't kill them afterwards, just as a means of revenge. So there are, and at the same time, even though the general principles run through things, the larger you get in scale, the more group agreement and consensus is needed. So, for example, if you're just one guy and you're suddenly attacked, well, you can make the decision to fight back right then and there, because that's the necessity of the situation. On the other hand, if you think the government that's ruling your country is tyrannical or on its way to being that, then the mainstream of Judeo-Christian thought would say, well, just because you think that, don't go running off and try to assassinate the head of state. That's a very grave decision that ultimately needs to be made by the people as a whole, and ideally should be made in part by intermediate magistrates. In the olden days, that might be the nobility, the aristocracy, the governors, the provinces, the mayors. In an American context, you'd have state governments, all these kind of intermediate institutions of local government and civil society. Don't go running off trying to overthrow the government, just on your own personal say-so, however sincere your beliefs are. Unless, of course, you're in a situation like Nazi Germany, where all those intermediate governments and civil society itself have been wiped out. So, in my view, the argument that self-defense is legitimate when it's the 5 people in your family attacked by a mob of 30 people outside, I think you can scale that up to national defense. I mean, certainly the critics of international warfare have a good point that a lot of international warfare, if you look at it over the years, has been unnecessary, more for the aggrandizement of the people in the government than for any good of the nation. But still, there are clearly some examples of situations where there's really, it's either be conquered and have society destroyed, or fight. I mean, when North Korea invaded South Korea, and South Korea was not exactly some democratic paradise at the time, but because they fought back successfully, they were in a position where South Korea, which was always freer than North Korea, could grow and over the years become what it is now, which is a functioning democracy with general respect for human rights. And if they hadn't fought back, then they'd be all in the same situation as North Koreans, essentially living in a slave state, isolated from the world that controls their minds in a very harmful way. What else could the people of Poland do when they're invaded by the Nazis except fight back? And what if America and Britain and the others hadn't fought back and we just let Hitler take over? The world would be much worse off. And for all the suffering that war causes, having Nazis or communists or similar folks take over causes vastly more suffering than a war ever could.
Thank you, David. And what then do you describe in the conclusion of that book, Defending Creation?
That a lot of the great world religions, including Judaism and Christianity, have as an important principle compassion for others. In Buddhism and Hinduism, it's called ahimsa. Christians think of it as the golden rule, as an expression of that principle. But the point is, you should love yourself, and you should also love other people as well. I think the pacifists say, well, yeah, we're for that principle, and that's why we will never use violence against another human being. But I think they are confusing the end of compassion for others with a particular means. and sometimes they let the means dominate to the detriment of the end. And if you're engaged in the world and compassionate for yourself and for others, the practical realities are you'll lots of times try to use force only as a last resort, but there may be times, and we've certainly seen them in world history and sometimes in people's individual lives, where that last resort is the only resort left. And to be compassionate, you need to use force to protect innocent life.
Thank you, David. And I'd love to move on next, if we may, to another work of yours, The Truth About Gun Control, a topic which seems to be at the forefront of American politics.
Yeah.
In that little book, you help us to see more clearly by focusing on the vital questions in the American gun control debate, things like who is sovereign in the United States. So is it the people themselves, or is it some elite determined to rule citizens who are seen as incapable of making choices about their own lives? I think that's only been exacerbated by COVID, perhaps. So considering considering some of those questions, then how is the right to keep and to bear arms central to American identity, and why have Americans always resisted gun control?
Well, as you say, the American political philosophy, which in its own nature views this as something that should be the natural law that's really applicable everywhere, is that the people are the sovereigns, and the government is not some great thing like the Japanese used to think their emperor was the descendant of the sun god, or that the ancient Egyptians thought that their ruling elite were the only people who could talk to the gods and the common people couldn't. The American view is sovereignty inheres in the people, and the government is a artificial creation of those people to be their agent. The government is the servant of the people and carries out many important things for the common good. It's a good, useful form of social organization. And part of the American gun control movement is something that casts an envious eye on what they imagine Europe to be, and sort of as we think about maybe France, you get this class of people who rises up through the entrance exams, goes to these top universities, and then they're called the anarchs, who then permeate the civil service and the top levels of government. And they're not bad people trying to tyrannize, but they are wiser, more educated, and they direct the society for the good of people who are better off being directed by these wise and well-educated people than the people would be trying to make decisions for themselves. And one of the ways they do that is preventing the people from having guns, except maybe under very limited conditions for sports, but certainly not for self-defense, because that's too chaotic for society in their view. Whereas and people wouldn't be competent enough to do it anyway. Whereas the traditional American view tends to be, no, people are actually capable of running their own lives in general, and of making the decision about whether to have a deadly weapon, whether it's an axe or a chainsaw or a firearm in their home, and being able to use it competently.
Thank you for that, David. And something I appreciate about your work is that greater historical awareness and maybe affording a greater historical literacy for people. So in line with that, I wanted to ask you about, what do you hope that readers will understand today about the American Revolution and the British attempts to confiscate guns, even going back?
Well, after the British and their American colonial allies won in 1763 what we in America call the French and Indian War, the British call the Great War for Empire, one of the first really truly global wars. Americans were very happy with their relationship with the British. But then, unfortunately, King George adopted this policy of, okay, we've been letting the Americans be pretty autonomous for a long time, but now we're going to start cracking down on them, and in many different ways, including stationing a permanent military in British North America to control these people, which Americans thought was pretty outrageous, since the point of the British military, in their view, was to help Americans fight the French. And once the French were gone from Canada, what do you need redcoats around for? So that this political crisis starts to begin around 1763 and goes on with its ups and downs for a dozen years. And things are getting tense. But what changes that increasingly volatile and acrimonious political situation into a war is when the British start trying to confiscate guns. King George in October 1774 embargoes all firearms and gunpowder shipments into the colonies. And Americans are not pleased with that, but they don't take up arms immediately. But then the war begins on April 19th, 1775, when the British Army comes out of Boston, marches to Lexington and Concord. They're looking for a big stash of gunpowder that their spies have told them the Americans have. They're looking for the gunpowder, and they're also conducting house-to-house searches and taking the firearms. And as the British are coming out, the Americans, with the alarm spread by Paul Revere and William Dawes and others, and then the alarm carried from town to town by firing off a gun, which is how it was the internet of its day. It's how you communicate rapidly at a distance. Americans come in swarming from all these other towns, and the Lexington militia and the Concord militia, they fight back. And even though the British accomplished most of their mission at Lexington and Concord, although the gunpowder got taken out of town before they arrived, on the way back, there's quite a wild gun battle, and the British Army is nearly wiped out. It's only saved by reinforcements and because the Americans start running out of gunpowder. And that's when the American Revolution begins, when the British showed they meant to rule America by force and not by consent, and proved it beyond any doubt by attempting to confiscate firearms. And, I know, some gun control advocates say, oh, look at the gun confiscations they did in the United Kingdom and in Australia, and those were so swell. And it's true. Well, maybe some people passively hid their guns, but the gun owners in that country mostly went along with it. I think it would be a dangerous mistake to assume that Americans would be equally submissive to a gun confiscation scenario.
Thanks, David. I want to ask you next about something equally fascinating and important. Can you tell us a little bit about the nation's first gun control organization, the Ku Klux Klan, and the constitutional response?
Sure. And obviously, before, in American history, there were not a lot of gun control laws in the country before the American Civil War in 1861, but there were some. For example, some states had laws that started with Kentucky in 1813 that said, oh, of course, it's fine to carry a gun or a sword openly, but you shouldn't wear concealed weapons, because why would you be doing that? Maybe you're trying to sneak up on somebody. So you had people who advocated for gun control in that sense as legislators. But the first organization that really dedicated itself to comprehensively disarming a lot of Americans was the Ku Klux Klan, formed originally by some former Confederate military officers who realized, well, okay, slavery's over with. Our side lost the war. 13th Amendment is the law of the land. Slavery's prohibited. But we still want to keep the now legally free Black population, the freedmen, as they were called, in a state of submission and servitude. And, we don't want them voting. We don't want them participating in politics. We don't want them, going out on their own and having meetings without public assemblies without prior permission, the way white people can have meetings without prior permission. And the Klan's strategy is first of all, a lot of them being ex-soldiers and officers, they've got horses, which gives them mobility. So their plan of operation is they'll say go to some community and with their horses conduct house-to-house raids on the freedmen's, homes and shacks and take away their guns. And then only after they've finished rounding up all the black people's guns in the community, that's when they start the next level of oppression, of saying, oh, well, maybe technically you're allowed to vote, but if you do, you may end up dead 2 nights after you voted. And all the other repressions for which the Klan is known. You better not write an article in the local newspaper complaining about what we do, because we will not just write a letter to the editor of the newspaper. We'll go out and attack you and maybe kill you and your family. So the same principle as Hitler. It's easier to oppress people when you take away their guns first. Doesn't mean every government that takes away people's guns is going to oppress them as viciously as the Ku Klux Klan or the Nazis or the communists did. But it's also true that all the oppressors almost always try to disarm the victims beforehand.
Mm-hmm. And I think in line with that then, David, why is it vital to show that gun control is not an issue of, say, left or right, or indeed urban or rural? And how might we do that to then get the message out there?
In some ways, we live in a golden age. Like television's never been better, with all a variety of things on you can see. And in some ways, we live in an unusually stupid age. So for example, vaccinations for COVID-19. It's a scientific issue. Not all science is never perfectly settled. There are risks and benefits to vaccination, but in the United States, we have this polarization over it. I mean, for example, the Black population being sort of mistrustful of the government in general, and for good reasons historically. They're the racial group that has the lowest level of vaccinations. And then you also have political stuff where some people, say, oh, COVID's just a hoax, or it's not really that dangerous. And sometimes this overlaps with people's like, oh, I'm very pro-Trump, so I'm not going to get that vaccine, even though it was in his presidency when we had Operation Warp Speed that led to the invention of these vaccines. And remember vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris, when back in the election summer, she said, oh no, I wouldn't take that Trump vaccine. Well, and now she's on the other side, and her administration's pushing vaccine mandates on everyone. Mm-hmm. And whatever the scientific risks and benefits of the vaccine, it really shouldn't ideally have anything to do with one's race or whether Democrat versus Republican or things like that. And likewise, the things we've been talking about today are basic issues. Is what are you going to do if some gang of people or a stalker, somebody like that, invades your home, and you can call police emergency services, 911 in the United States. And if you get lucky, they'll show up in several minutes. If you're unlucky, it could take considerably longer. So there's going to be that period where you're either going to have the ability to protect your family or you won't. Now, what should that have to do with being a Democrat or a Republican or any race or anything else? Mm-hmm. And one of the ways we're stupider in the United States than we used to be is gun control has gotten polarized as a Republican versus Democrat issue, which it certainly wasn't always. I mean, back in 2010, if you looked at the U.S. Congress, there were plenty of Democrats who would call themselves pro-gun, pro-Second Amendment. They might vote for some gun controls here and there, but they certainly didn't view themselves as hostile to the gun culture. And one of the ways we're going downhill in the United States has been so many things get fought over as culture wars, and it's team A versus team B, and you're just trying to make life miserable for the other team, even if it really doesn't do you any good. Just their suffering is enough to cause people political satisfaction, and it's very unfortunate that the constitutional rights and fundamental human rights, like the fundamental, natural, universal right of self-defense, get caught up in these petty wars that Americans waste a lot of their time on.
Mhm. And again, in some articles, you even show that American gun control had a close connection with things like slavery and the maintenance of a racial caste system. Can you tell us a little bit about that history and how libertarians, conservatives, those more open-minded Democrats that you mentioned, should approach this issue in contrast with the kind of dominant ideological and state-centered narrative of the likes of the 1619 Project today?
Sure. Well, you have, just to tell you a little story on this 1619 Project, which is the brainchild of Hannah Nicole Jones of the New York Times, who I was following on Twitter. She and her Twitter handle is Ida Bay Wells, B.A., some kind of young people's phrase these days, but named after Ida B. Wells, who was one of the great journalists in American history, a Black woman in the late 19th and early 20th century, who in Memphis and really around the world exposed the problem of lynching in the United States. And lynching had always gone on, but around the 1880s, it took a big racial turn. And for the first time, the majority of people lynched in the South were Blacks. And people in other regions didn't necessarily approve of it, but they thought, oh, maybe it's some kind of rough justice, because usually the people that are lynching are miscreants of one type or another. And the real Ida B. Wells showed how that wasn't true, that it wasn't that they were just giving summary justice to criminals. It was much more typically, it was a Black man and a white woman had sex, and then later they got found out and it had been consensual, but the white woman now says, oh, he raped me, because she's got to mollify her parents by making that claim. And so the Black man gets lynched. And Ida Wells observed how, what can, one person or one small family do against a lynch mob? And she looked at the practical examples of where people thwarted lynch mobs and frightened them off or drove them off. And one of the things that happened in those situations was the Black defenders had repeating rifles. And they were commonly known as Winchester rifles, just like many people call all carbonated sodas a Coca-Cola. It was these repeating multi-shot Winchester rifles where you could fire shot after shot after shot without having to reload. That when you have some Black defenders with a few Winchester rifles, and there's a mob of 100 angry white men there, they see the Black defenders with the Winchesters, they go home. So Ida Wells says every Black home should have a well-oiled Winchester rifle. And after Nicole Jones tweeted out posing as Ida Bay Wells, tweeted out some, gun ownership is part of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. I quote tweeted her and then put in the quote from the real Ida B. Wells that no, actually gun ownership, and especially of Winchester repeating rifles, is a great antidote to white supremacy.
Mhm.
And of course, Hannah Nicole Jones, like a lot of her cohorts who imagine that they are woke, couldn't handle a contrary point of view, and so she blocked me. And, yeah, and gun control in the United States, in a mass sense, is very much a Southern phenomenon that came after the Civil War, as the racist white state governments aimed to keep the Black population in a state of subjugation. And after the United States Constitution was amended with the 14th Amendment in 1868 to say that no state can deny any person the equal protection of the laws, the states, the ex-Confederate states, couldn't have laws that officially said, here are special gun restrictions on Black people, but instead they moved to things like saying, oh, here's our licensing law for when you can carry a gun, which, by the way, we mainly enforce, or maybe exclusively enforce, against the Black population. So of course, not all modern people who want gun control in the United States are racist, but the history of gun control in the United States is absolutely a history of white supremacy and oppression.
Thank you for that, David. And I want to ask you next something slightly different. If this isn't too much to ask, it's a hard one, I suppose, to distill. But I was wondering, what place do you have for principled arguments and consequentialist arguments, and how would you filter each of them into the discussion?
Oh, you got to have both. And this go back to the Judeo-Christian debate. Is there are some pacifists who make principled arguments, or make practical arguments, that it's just, you get less net suffering in the world if people don't use force. And I'm not sure those practical arguments hold up. And others have sort of the more principled things, like, no, there's just this absolute rule, you can never shed blood, and who cares what the consequences are. It's like in Jewish law, you don't debate about whether nutrition would be improved if Jews ate pork and shellfish. There's just a rule, you don't, and that settles it. So likewise, the gun issue in general kind of has to have both arguments. Most people care about the practical consequences. Like, for example, in the United States, over the last 4 decades or so, most states have adopted laws that ensure that a law-abiding adult who passes background check and safety training can get a permit to carry a handgun for lawful protection. And that which was the norm throughout American history, but that right got really constricted from the middle of the 20th century until about 1980, when then the pendulum began swinging back the other way. And so people care about the practical consequences. Well, if this happens, we're going to have shootouts at McDonald's because the French fries were cold and the customer shot the cashier. And we had all kinds of warnings about that. Oh, it'll be the Wild West and we'll have road rage and all these things. Well, it turned out it didn't. That the people with concealed carry, because they're people who lawfully go in for background checks to get fingerprinted, safety training. Also, they can get a little card that says you can do this thing. You can carry a concealed gun. Well, you can carry a concealed gun anyway because it's concealed, so nobody knows you're doing it. And so you only have these people who are so hyper law abiding. They want this permission slip, and will go through a process and pay $150 in fees and training to get it. So it turns out they are highly law-abiding. They're not perfect, but they are vastly more law-abiding than any other known segment of the American population. Maybe with the exception of nuns. So it turns out these people are not dangerous at all. Whether it affects the overall crime rate in a good way, that's sociologists can debate that. But we can see for sure that these people don't cause trouble overall. That's a practical thing that really matters. On the other hand, there are also people who would say, well, who cares about the practicalities? The Second Amendment recognizes my right to keep, and the right of all Americans to keep and bear arms. So, it doesn't say keep and bear arms after the social science studies show that it's harmless. You just got the right to do it, period. And even and of course the United States is one of only a few countries with a written constitutional right to arms. But you could say, well, even besides that, people obviously have the natural right of self-defense, and by implication, they have at least a right to the tools necessary to effectuate that right. That doesn't have to be a gun necessarily, but often it is. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's yin and yang. You need principles and practicality, and they exist best when they're harmonious, including not pushing principles all the way to their logical extreme.
Amen. And I should say, as you're sort of revealing to us, these are issues that speak beyond America's shores. This is of interest and importance, vital importance to all of us. And throughout your work and different articles and everything, you give different examples from around the world, including offering my wife's country, Zimbabwe, as another example. And you've detailed China's cultural revolution in a series of excellent articles. In line with that, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the key takeaways from such international cases and their vital relevance today, those beyond America's shores?
That oppression doesn't always follow from the people being disarmed. So Luxembourg basically completely bans guns. And the government of the Duchy of Luxembourg is not perpetrating genocide there. People have a freedom of the press, freedom of religion there. But if you look at the places where there are widespread systemic violations of human rights, they've almost always been preceded by the disarmament of the people, and the disarmament was a very important part of it. I mean, the reason in China, Tibet, Zimbabwe, Darfur, and the Sudan, I would argue, Ireland, in that period of English colonialism, which was way better than Maoism, but still not very pleasing to a lot of the Irish people. Oppression is always effectuated by disarmament.
Thank you, David. And then how do we respond to skeptics who might say that the state will always outgun us, or that more guns wouldn't have helped in different cases, but only led to more bloodshed? I think you've already addressed some of that.
Well, there's certainly, no guarantee that an armed population will be able to defeat a tyrant with a standing army. And you can think of examples around the world where the tyrant has prevailed. I mean, look at the Assad regime still rules Syria, for example. So this gets to the practicalities of what can you do. But if you look at the Turkish Ottoman Empire's genocide against the Armenians and the Assyrians and other Christians in World War I, the Armenians and the Assyrians and Chaldeans and others were able to some extent to obtain arms and resist. Now, could they overthrow the government? Absolutely not. But there were plenty of time, and there were times when sometimes a resisting town was besieged, and eventually it drove the attackers off. Other times when the besieged town was eventually conquered and all the people were killed. But overall, the Armenian and other Christian resistance during World War I in the Ottoman Empire saved at least a couple 100,000 lives, maybe more. That's better off. Likewise, when the Tibetans engaged in armed resistance to the Maoist imperial invasion of Tibet in the 1950s, they ultimately did not win the war. China is part of, or Tibet is part of China's colonial empire today. But the Tibetan resistance did allow 80,000 Tibetans to flee, to escape to India or Nepal. it brought attention and it allowed the Dalai Lama to escape. And because they allowed that diaspora to escape, it saved Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, Tibetan Buddhism in China is something that's in Tibet, illegitimately ruled as a province of China. The government's very much trying to keep it under the government jackboot. But with the Dalai Lama and others free, they've been able to spread the Tibetan Buddhist religion globally, and to tell that story and keep alive, on the global stage, the dreams of Tibet eventually regaining its self-government against totalitarian imperialism, and all the Tibetans in that diaspora are part of the fruits of that resistance. So you don't always have to win the big game and topple the king to accomplish some good by armed resistance.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. And another fascinating thing from an outsider's perspective is how after every school shooting, which they are terrible, and we can all agree, you have, however, people like Piers Morgan famously jumping almost on these tragedies to make their preferred arguments. I wanted to ask you about that, and what are a few of the many alternative solutions that you offer in your writings to more simplistic conceptions, like, say, Morgan, for one example?
Well, and remember, cable television news and the business of being a Piers Morgan or any other character like that is a business. And, there is more advertising and sales and viewers to be found in stoking outrage. And that's, of course, not an issue just in school shootings, but it goes on all kinds of issues. And that gets back to the polarization problem we talked about, is the business model of a lot of media has been promote outrage, sort of a stepped up model of Twitter clickbait, except Twitter clickbait as an entire television network or multiple television networks. So it's certainly accurate to say that if there were no guns in the United States, you'd have no school shootings, because there wouldn't be. And people could still use propane tank bombs or other things, or arson, to try to kill people. But school shooters typically choose firearms because it's easier to do that than it is to figure out, say, how to make a bomb. But then the question is, what are you going to actually do in a practical sense? I was on the Piers Morgan show, and one time, and he was talking about how many guns there are in the United States, and there's too many guns. And I said, well, okay, we've got about 400 million or so guns in the United States. What do you think would be the correct number of that? And he comes back, well, how about zero? Well, that's fine as a philosophical point, but getting to zero isn't something that can practically be done. We know that of all the crimes that exist, mass shootings in general, and including school shootings, are ones that are planned long in advance. These aren't the case if somebody had a bad day. Sometimes that happens with domestic violence, but not these mass attacks. They're planned for months in advance. And in a country with 400 million guns, and including some police departments where there may be a corrupt person who would even sell police guns to criminals, and likewise in thefts from the military armories and things like that, there's no realistic way you're going to deprive these people of firearms if they're willing to plan for months in advance. So we can think about other things to do. One of the things is, the see something, say something, all that kind of thing. And boy, after the Columbine attacks in 1999, there were a lot of, and these two criminals gave off lots of warning signs. And the good thing is there are lots of other shootings and other crimes that have been stopped because people did respond to the warning signs And so there was intervention to stop the crime before it happened. Sadly, the shootings at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, that was another case where the guy was absolutely giving off warning signs. Everybody could see it, and nothing got done about it, partly because of the willful negligence of the local sheriff's office. So that's one thing, is act preemptively. Secondly, I think it's good to, and we've made some progress on this in the United States, still a ways to go, but improving access to mental health services. It's not all school shooters are mentally ill, but a great deal of mass shooters are. And again, it's really important to say out front that mentally ill people in general are not a violent, dangerous class. They're not, they have their troubles, but their extra involvement in crime is mostly that they get victimized more than other people. But it's also true that when you look at mass murderers, you do have a much higher percentage than in the general population of severe mental illness, often psychosis and schizophrenia. And again, most people with schizophrenia, even severe schizophrenia, are not violently dangerous. But this subset of those who perpetrate the mass shootings do suffer from these mental illnesses often. So more mental health resources are important. And then in the last event, it's, well, when do mass shootings stop? Well, when the police show up. The criminal in Newtown, Connecticut, at the elementary school there, carried out killings in a fairly leisurely way over about a 5-minute period. Had changed the magazines in his gun many times. Had so much time he would drop a half empty magazine on the floor and reload. Had all the time he wanted for about 5 minutes till the police came. And then he came and they came and he killed himself. And that's a common ending for things. So the thing is, how long is that interval between when the attack begins and then the criminal stops the attack because there's now armed counterforce? At the Independence Institute, where we work, we participate in a program that exists in many other states called FASTER, Faculty and Staff Training for Emergency Response. And it was originated in Ohio, goes on a lot of places. And so what we do is we, using expert staff, police, highly trained police officers, for example, train school staff, teachers, administrators, others, in emergency response. And that includes, emergency medical care. How do you stop someone from bleeding out so they can live, for the next 15 minutes until the ambulance can get there and get them to a hospital? And we also train them in defensive combat, in how to fight back against violent armed invaders of a school, including school shooters. And we've trained now hundreds of people who were in schools all over Colorado in doing this. And in Colorado, school districts have their own policies. So one school district might not want any armed staff. Others would say, well, yes, but only if you've had some advanced training like the FASTER program. And, we know in the United States, there are many mass shootings that you never read about, in the Irish Times or hear about on the BBC, because they were stopped before they became a mass shooting, because there was an armed defender available and the criminal got stopped before the casualty count could grow so large that it made the international news.
Thanks very much for that, David. And thank you very much for your time today. I just want to ask you before we go then, is there anything else that you're working on now at the moment, or that you still feel the passion to get involved with in the future you'd like to tell us about?
I guess my big project for this year and continuing is my 2 law school textbooks. One is the first textbook on the law school textbook on the Second Amendment. It's called Firearms Law and the Second Amendment, Regulation, Rights, and Policy. Now coming in its 3rd edition, and that's been keeping me very busy. And I'm also the author of I'm co-author of that firearms book with 4 other professors. And I'm also author of the first book on first law school textbook on the Colorado Constitution, Colorado constitutional law and history. And one of the ways we can overcome polarization in this country is by, among other things, graduate level education that creates a safe space where people can debate the pro and cons on issues and learn about their history and learn about their rights.
Fantastic. Thank God for it. And God bless you with your work, David.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate being on this program.